Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. Story 1, Whispers in the Fog. It started with the fog. Thick, unnatural, and stretching as far as the eye could see. When I moved to the small coastal town of Ravensport, I expected peace, a slower pace of life. But the fog brought something with it, something I couldn't explain. The townsfolk never spoke about it directly, only in hushed whispers when they thought no one was listening. They called it the Veil. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was just an old folk tale meant to scare outsiders. But then the voices started. Soft murmurs drifting through the mist, calling my name, urging me to follow. Ravensport was an old town, built on jagged cliffs overlooking the endless, churning ocean. The people who lived here carried a quiet, almost haunted demeanor. The buildings, once grand in their Victorian architecture, now stood worn and weathered, their facades beaten by the salty wind. I had rented an old house on the outskirts, perched near the woods. It was cheap, too cheap, and I should have questioned why. But I wanted solitude, a place to reset my life. A place where I could breathe. On my first night, the fog rolled in heavier than I had ever seen. It blanketed the town, swallowing the streets and muffling the sounds of distant waves crashing against the shore. And then came the whispers. Faint. Insistent. At first, I thought it was the wind. But the way they wove around my name, curling through the walls of my home, felt intentional. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I visited the local diner. The waitress, an elderly woman named Martha, eyed me with something close to pity as she poured my coffee. "You live out by Hollow Road, don't you?" she asked. I nodded. She pursed her lips, glanced toward the fog-laden streets, then leaned in. "Don't go out at night. No matter what you hear." I scoffed. "What do you mean?" Martha hesitated, then simply said, "The Veil doesn't like to be disturbed." I laughed it off, thinking it was just small-town superstition. But that night, when the fog thickened once more and the whispers returned, closer this time, I started to reconsider. One evening, I made the mistake of following the whispers. They led me down a road that shouldn't exist, into a part of town that had long been forgotten. The buildings loomed over me, their windows shattered, their doorways dark and yawning. My heart pounded as I stepped inside what used to be an old schoolhouse, its walls crumbling with age. A child's voice called my name. I turned and saw her. A girl, no older than 10, standing in the center of the room, her dress tattered, her skin pale as the mist itself. She lifted a hand, pointing at something behind me. I didn't want to look, but I did. A dozen figures stood in the shadows, their hollow eyes fixated on me. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering the same phrase over and over again. "You're one of us now." The next morning, I woke up on my doorstep, soaked to the bone, my feet covered in mud. I had no memory of how I got there. But clutched in my hand was something small and cold, a locket, rusted shut, with initials I didn't recognize. I spent days trying to shake the experience, convincing myself I had sleepwalked. But then I started seeing figures in the mist during the day, watching, waiting. And at night, the fog whispered even louder, its voices growing more desperate, more demanding. I sought answers from the town's historian, an old man named Elias Grayson. He sighed heavily when I told him what I had experienced. "The Veil doesn't just come for anyone," he murmured. "It chooses." I swallowed hard. Chooses who? Elias leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Those it wants to keep. The fog thickened with each passing night. I could feel it pressing against my windows, seeping through the cracks in my walls. And then, one night, I heard my mother's voice. But my mother had been dead for years. "Come outside, sweetheart," she cooed, just beyond my door. "I've missed you so much." Tears burned in my eyes. I knew it wasn't real. Knew it was a trick. And yet, I reached for the door. What happened next is something I struggle to put into words. The town, the real Ravensport, seemed to dissolve as I stepped into the fog. The ground beneath me shifted, and the voices swelled into a chorus of laughter, sorrow, and something else, something hungry. I saw them. The lost ones. The ones who had followed the whispers before me. Their faces contorted in agony, their hands reaching, pleading. I ran. I thought I had escaped, but the locket I found that night began to change. One evening, as I turned it over in my hands, the rust flaked away, revealing a small, engraved name, Lillian. The name sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know why, but it felt familiar. I started dreaming of the girl from the schoolhouse. Each night, she stood closer. Each night, her whispers became clearer. "Find me," she begged. "Help me." I scoured the town archives, poring over faded newspaper clippings. And then I found it, Lillian Harper, a 10-year-old girl who vanished without a trace nearly 70 years ago. Her last known whereabouts? The abandoned schoolhouse. I knew what I had to do. The next night, I walked back to the schoolhouse, the locket clutched in my fist. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating. The moment I stepped inside, the whispers fell silent. The girl stood in the same spot as before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them. Their eyes hollow, their voices weaving together in a single desperate plea. "Help us." I reached out, offering the locket to Lillian. She hesitated before taking it. The moment her fingers touched the metal, a bright, searing light erupted from within. The shadows screamed, recoiling as the light spread through the room. The fog outside trembled, thinning as if being pulled away by an unseen force. Lillian looked at me, tears in her ghostly eyes. "Thank you," she whispered before vanishing. The fog lifted that night. The whispers faded. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. But I know Ravensport's secrets will never truly disappear. The veil may be silent for now, but one day it will return. And when it does, I hope someone will be there to listen. Story 2, Echoes of the Lost. The night was colder than usual, and the small town of Blackwood lay silent under the silver glow of the full moon. Ethan had just finished his shift at the old diner on the outskirts of town. As he locked up, he pulled his jacket tighter around himself, cursing the biting wind. The road home was a long, lonely stretch through the woods, but he had walked it countless times before. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he stepped onto the path leading through the dense forest, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just the rustling leaves. But with each step, the whispers grew louder, turning into incoherent murmurs. He quickened his pace, his breath coming out in white puffs in the freezing air. The town wasn't far now. Just a few more minutes and he'd be home. Then he heard it, a sharp, piercing cry echoing through the trees. He stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. It was distant yet chilling, like someone screaming in agony. He turned around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "Just keep walking," he muttered to himself, forcing his legs to move. But the scream came again, closer this time. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his curiosity got the better of him. Against his better judgment, he stepped off the path, moving towards the source of the sound. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. As he ventured deeper, the air grew heavier, filled with a damp, musty scent. Then he saw it, an old, abandoned house standing in the middle of a clearing. It looked ancient, its wooden walls warped and rotting. The front door hung open slightly, swaying with the wind. Ethan hesitated, every fiber of his being telling him to turn back. But then he heard a faint sobbing coming from inside. "Hello," he called out, stepping closer. No response. He pushed the door open with a creak, his pulse pounding. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim moonlight filtering through the broken windows barely illuminated the room. Old furniture lay scattered, covered in cobwebs. The sobbing grew louder, leading him to a narrow staircase that spiraled up into darkness. He took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. As he reached the top, he saw a door slightly ajar, a faint glow coming from within. He pushed it open, revealing a small room with a single rocking chair in the center. A woman sat there, her back to him, rocking slowly. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands, obscuring her face. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Ethan asked cautiously. The woman stopped rocking. The room fell into an eerie silence. Slowly, she turned her head towards him, and Ethan's blood ran cold. Her face was hollow, her eyes sunken and lifeless, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. The door slammed shut behind him. The whispers from the forest now filled the room, growing louder, more menacing. The woman stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural. Ethan stumbled back, reaching for the doorknob, but the wood felt like ice against his skin. He turned it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The woman took a step closer, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. "Stay with me," she crooned, her voice layered with other voices, as if 1,000 souls spoke through her. Ethan's vision blurred, his body growing weaker as the room seemed to close in around him. Shadows slithered along the walls, taking shape, whispering his name. His breath hitched as he realized he was not alone. The last thing he heard before darkness consumed him was the woman's chilling laughter, echoing through the empty house. The next morning, the townsfolk found the old house just as it had always been, abandoned, untouched. But Ethan was never seen again. Some say his whispers still echo through the forest on cold, moonlit nights, warning others to never stray from the path. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's disappearance became the talk of the town. The local authorities searched the woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His mother, distraught, pleaded for someone to search the old house, but no one dared. The legends about the place were too strong, the fear too deeply ingrained in the town's history. One night, Ethan's best friend, Caleb, made up his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was still out there, trapped, waiting for help. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, he set out on the same path Ethan had taken. The moment he stepped into the woods, an unnatural silence settled around him. It was as if the forest itself was watching. As he reached the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. The old house stood before him, just as eerie as the stories described. The door, despite being abandoned for decades, creaked open as if inviting him in. Caleb hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of unease. He called out Ethan's name, but the only answer was the distant sound of a rocking chair creaking upstairs. His flashlight flickered as he climbed the stairs, each step making his heartbeat louder in his ears. The moment he reached the top, the whispering began. It was faint at first, then grew into an overwhelming chorus of voices, calling his name. The door to the room stood ajar, the glow from within pulsating like a heartbeat. He pushed it open. The rocking chair was moving. Slowly. A figure sat in it, back facing him. But it wasn't Ethan. It was the woman. Her head turned unnaturally fast, revealing her twisted, grinning face. Caleb screamed as the shadows in the room surged towards him, the voices merging into one final, chilling whisper. You shouldn't have come. The town never saw Caleb again. The stories grew, warnings whispered from one generation to the next. The woods became a forbidden place, the old house left to rot in its eerie solitude. But on cold nights, when the wind howled through the trees, those who dared listen could still hear them, the whispers of the lost, forever trapped in the darkness. Years later, a group of teenagers, daring each other to prove their bravery, ventured into the woods. The town's warnings had become nothing more than urban legends to them. They laughed as they approached the clearing, mocking the supposed hauntings. But the moment they crossed the threshold of the old house, the air around them shifted. The whispers returned, faint at first, then rising into a chorus of voices. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The next morning, the townsfolk found no trace of them. The house stood silent, just as it always had. But if you listened closely on the wind, you could hear new voices among the whispers, voices pleading for help, forever lost in the darkness. Story 3: The Frozen Whisper. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind that crept into the bones and refused to leave. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the remote mountain road in an eerie silence. Thomas Morgan gripped the steering wheel of his old Jeep, his knuckles white as he navigated through the desolate wilderness. The only sounds were the rhythmic swish of wipers against the windshield and the occasional groan of the wind through the towering pine trees. Thomas had been driving for hours, his mind fogged with exhaustion. He was on his way to the old cabin his grandfather had left him, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was meant to be a retreat, a quiet getaway from the chaos of his life in the city. But as the snow deepened and the road narrowed, he began to wonder if this was a mistake. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman, draped in a tattered coat, her face obscured by shadows. Thomas slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy road. His heart pounded. He hesitated, staring at the figure, then reluctantly rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman took a slow step forward, her movements unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Help me." Thomas swallowed hard, glancing at the empty road behind her. There were no footprints in the snow. No sign of how she got there. Something wasn't right. A flickering sense of dread settled in his chest, but he forced himself to open the door. The woman's eyes met his, dark, hollow pools that swallowed the light. He froze. Then she screamed. A deafening, gut-wrenching shriek that pierced the night. Thomas stumbled back, his foot slipping on the ice. The woman lunged forward, her fingers clawing at him. He barely managed to scramble back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled to put the car in reverse, the tires spinning uselessly against the slick road. The woman pressed her hands against the window, her nails scraping against the glass. Her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. Thomas sat frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The windshield was clear. The road was empty. Had he imagined it? No. The frost-covered handprints on the glass told him otherwise. By the time he reached the cabin, his nerves were frayed. He parked hastily, practically falling out of the Jeep as he rushed up the porch steps. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing the darkened interior. The cabin smelled of aged wood and something faintly metallic. He turned on the lights, casting long shadows across the floor. Snowflakes clung to his jacket as he shut the door behind him, locking it tight. He tried to shake off the encounter. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, exhaustion playing cruel tricks. But deep down, he knew better. Something had followed him. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, howling against the windows. Thomas sat by the fireplace, nursing a glass of whiskey, trying to calm his nerves. Then he heard it. A soft knock. His breath hitched. He turned his head slowly toward the door. Another knock. Louder this time. He hesitated. His gut screamed at him not to move, but his body betrayed him. He rose, inching toward the door, his fingers hovering over the handle. Thomas. The voice sent ice through his veins. It was her. The woman from the road. He staggered back, his mind racing. She couldn't be here. It wasn't possible. The knocking turned to pounding. The entire door rattled. Then it stopped. Silence. He stood there, heart hammering against his ribs, waiting. Minutes stretched into eternity. Slowly, he reached for the curtain, pulling it back just an inch to peer outside. Nothing. Just the snow-covered landscape. The Jeep, half buried in white. The dense trees swaying in the wind. Then, a movement. A shadow shifting in the tree lane. Thomas swallowed hard. His instinct screamed at him to run, but where? The cabin was miles from civilization. His only option was to wait it out until morning. He backed away from the window, gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline. The wind howled. The cabin creaked. Then he heard the whisper. Inside the house. You let me in. His blood turned to ice. The lights flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room. Thomas turned slowly, every muscle in his body locked in terror. She was inside. Standing at the foot of the stairs, her dark eyes locked onto his. A slow, eerie smile spread across her lips. Her face twisted, her features elongating into something inhuman. The last thing Thomas saw before the lights went out was her reaching for him, her fingers stretching impossibly long, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The storm swallowed the cabin whole. And then there was nothing but the wind and the snow. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving behind an untouched blanket of white. The cabin stood still and silent. A search party arrived by noon, alerted by Thomas's employer when he never returned his calls. They found the Jeep, the keys still in the ignition. The door to the cabin was wide open, snow drifting inside. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no tracks leading away. Inside, the fire had long since died, its embers cold. On the frost-covered window, written in shaky letters, were the words, "You let me in." Thomas Morgan was never seen again. But the legend did not end there. Locals whispered of strange occurrences near the cabin. Those who ventured too close spoke of an unnatural cold, of ghostly figures glimpsed through the trees, of whispers carried on the wind. Some claim to have seen a lone figure standing at the cabin's window, watching, waiting. One night, a group of hikers took shelter in the abandoned cabin. By morning, only one remained, curled in the corner, muttering the same phrase over and over again. "She's still here. She never left." The authorities found no trace of the others. Just a single set of footprints leading out into the woods. And then, nothing. Years later, a reporter decided to investigate the legend, staying overnight in the cabin with his recording equipment. His last transmission was a garbled, static-filled whisper. "She's inside. Don't open the door. Don't." The signal cut out. His body was never found. But the recording? It ended with a knock. Story 4: The Forgotten Room. David Carter, 27, had just moved into an old apartment building in downtown Boston. He was an architect, fresh off a big project, and wanted a quiet place to live while he planned his next move. The building was historic, built in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and a rustic charm that attracted people who appreciated old-world aesthetics. The rent was surprisingly cheap, but David didn't think much of it until he started noticing something strange about his new home. His apartment, 3B, was a spacious one-bedroom unit with a vintage fireplace, exposed brick walls, and large windows that let in just enough sunlight to keep the place from feeling gloomy. However, on his first night, while unpacking, he noticed something odd. The blueprint he had received from the landlord showed that the apartment had a rectangular shape, but upon closer inspection, the hallway wall didn't align with the exterior walls of the building. There was a gap, an entire section of space that didn't seem to exist. His curiosity was piqued. As an architect, he was used to studying blueprints and layouts, and this discrepancy bothered him more than it should have. He knocked on the wall. It was hollow. "There's definitely something behind here," he murmured. The next day, he decided to investigate. He ran his hands along the old wallpaper, pressing gently until he felt a slight indentation. As he pushed harder, a section of the wallpaper peeled away, revealing a faint outline of what seemed to be a door. His heart pounded. Why would there be a hidden door in an apartment? More importantly, why was it sealed off? Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, he carefully cut along the edges, pulling away more of the wallpaper. The door was wooden, with a rusted handle that seemed untouched for decades. He hesitated before twisting the knob. It was locked. But as luck would have it, his set of keys had an old-fashioned brass key that looked like it belonged to the same era as the apartment. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. A wave of cold air rushed out, sending shivers down his spine. He fumbled for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The room was small, barely big enough for a twin-sized bed and a nightstand. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, curling at the edges, and in the center of the room was an old wooden chair with a thick leather strap attached to its armrests. But what caught David's attention was the diary sitting on the nightstand. He picked it up carefully, wiping off the dust. The cover was cracked leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. The first entry was dated March 5th, 1952. "They told me I would be safe here. They lied." David sat down on his couch, flipping through the diary. The entries were frantic, scribbled in uneven handwriting. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Eleanor Fields had been locked in the hidden room by someone, possibly her family or the building's owners. She wrote about hearing whispers at night, of shadows moving outside the crack beneath the door. The last entry, dated May 21st, 1952, sent a chill down his spine. I hear them. They are coming. I tried to tell them, but they don't believe me. The whispers are real. They live in the walls. If someone finds this, please don't open the door. David swallowed hard. This wasn't just an abandoned space, it had history. A dark one. That night, as he lay in bed, something strange happened. He woke up to the sound of whispers. Faint, almost like the wind, but definitely human. He sat up, his heart pounding. It's just my imagination, he told himself. But then, he heard it again. Louder this time. He grabbed his phone and tiptoed toward the forgotten room. The door was still open, and the chair in the center seemed to have moved slightly. The diary was no longer on the nightstand, it was now on the floor, open to a page he hadn't seen before. If you hear them, it's already too late. David tried to ignore it. Over the next few days, he threw himself into work, avoiding the room as much as possible. But the more he ignored it, the worse things got. The whispers turned into murmurs. Objects in his apartment moved on their own. The air inside the hidden room grew colder, even when the rest of the apartment was warm. One night, as he was working late, his lights flickered. The whispers turned into voices. They were calling his name. His phone buzzed. A notification, an unknown number. The text read, "Get out." David's hands trembled. He turned toward the hidden room. The door, which he had closed, was now wide open. And inside, the chair was no longer empty. A shadowy figure sat there, motionless. It had no facial features, no eyes, just a void where a human face should be. The whispers turned into a deafening chorus. David stumbled back, heart hammering in his chest. The diary's pages flipped wildly on their own before stopping at the very last entry. They don't let you leave. The lights in the apartment shut off completely. In the darkness, the whispers became a single voice, right behind him. "Welcome home." David screamed. The next morning, his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, knocked on his door. No answer. She had heard strange noises all night and was worried. The landlord arrived with a spare key and opened the door. David was gone. The apartment was eerily silent, except for a single detail that made the landlord's blood run cold. The hidden room, which no one had known about for decades, was sealed shut once again. And on the dusty nightstand, the diary now had a new entry, written in fresh ink. "I tried to leave. Now, I am one of them." The police were called, but no sign of forced entry or struggle was found. David's belongings remained untouched, his phone still on the kitchen counter with a single unread message. The authorities ruled it a missing person case, but the landlord refused to rent the unit again. A few months later, a new tenant moved into 3B, unaware of its dark history. On their first night, they too noticed the whispers. The cycle had begun again. And this time, the shadows were waiting. If you're enjoying our stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which story you liked the most. And if you're still up, Explore our channel for more amazing stories.